The story of the Winter War does not begin with the roar of artillery, but with the silence of the forest. To understand the events that unfolded between Finland and the Soviet Union in the winter of 1939, one must first understand the land itself. Imagine a landscape dominated by the color white and the deep green of pines. This is a country of 60,000 lakes, a labyrinth of water and earth where the ground is often more liquid than solid during the summer, but in the winter it becomes a single, frozen expanse. The Karelian Isthmus, the narrow strip of land separating Lake Ladoga from the Gulf of Finland, is the gateway. It is a place of thick forests, rocky outcrops, and marshes that, when the temperature drops, turn into flat, open plains of ice. In the late autumn of 1939, the world was already holding its breath. War had consumed Poland. The great powers of Europe were looking nervously at their borders. But in the far north, the Finns looked to the east. For weeks, negotiations had been taking place in Moscow. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, was concerned about the security of Leningrad. This great city, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, sat only 20 miles from the Finnish border. In the eyes of the Soviet High Command, this proximity was an intolerable risk. They demanded that Finland cede territory on the Karelian Isthmus, destroy fortifications, and lease the Hanko Peninsula for a naval base. In exchange, they offered desolate land in Rupola and Porajevi, far to the north. To the Finns, this was not a trade. It was a dismantling of their national defense. To give up the isthmus was to open the door to their heartland. The Finnish government refused. The negotiations broke down in mid-November. The Finnish delegates packed their bags and returned to Helsinki. There was a strange sense of calm, a hope that perhaps the Soviet Union was merely posturing, that the sheer logistics of a winter campaign would deter an invasion. But in the Kremlin, the decision had already been made. Maps were drawn. Divisions were mobilized. The narrative was being crafted. On November 26th, a Sunday, the silence on the border was broken. Explosions were heard near the village of Mainila on the Soviet side. The Soviet government claimed that Finnish artillery had fired upon their troops, killing 4 and wounding 9. The Finns, who had pulled their artillery back specifically to avoid such an incident, knew immediately that it was a fabrication. It was a classic provocation, a pretext for war. The Finns proposed a joint investigation. The Soviets responded by renouncing the non-aggression pact. 3 days later, the diplomatic ties were severed. The soldiers on the border, young men mostly, clad in gray wool and civil guard uniforms, watched the tree line. They smoked cigarettes, checked the bolts of their Mosin-Nagant rifles, and waited. The temperature was dropping. The ground was beginning to harden. Then came the morning of November 30th. It began at 6:50 in the morning on the Karelian Isthmus. The artillery barrage was not a precise surgical strike. It was a rolling thunder that shook the earth for miles. Following the shells came the Red Army. It was an invasion of staggering scale. 450,000 Soviet soldiers, 21 divisions, marched across the border. They were supported by 2,500 tanks and nearly 4,000 aircraft. Against them stood the Finnish army, which could muster perhaps 160,000 men, with barely 30 tanks and a handful of outdated aircraft. On paper, the war was already over. The Soviet planners had prepared for a victory parade in Helsinki within 2 weeks. They had even instructed their troops not to cross the Swedish border by mistake, so confident were they of sweeping through Finland entirely. In Helsinki, the morning brought not just news of the border crossing, but terror from the skies. Soviet bombers, DB-3 types, appeared over the capital. The air raid sirens wailed, a sound that would become the haunting soundtrack of the winter. Bombs fell on the central district. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Civilians ran for cover, clutching children and belongings. The Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, would claim on the radio that the planes were not dropping bombs, but baskets of bread for the starving Finnish workers. The Finns, with a grim and dark humor that would define their resistance, began calling the Soviet incendiary bombs Molotov's bread baskets. Later, they would name a makeshift anti-tank weapon after him, a drink to go with the food, the Molotov cocktail. But the war would be decided on the ground, in the deep snow and the forests. The Soviet strategy was a broad front assault. They attacked not just on the isthmus, the obvious route, but all along the 1,000-mile border, from the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean in the north to the wilderness of Karelia in the center. This surprised the Finnish high command. They had not believed the Soviets could move heavy mechanized divisions through the dense, roadless forests of central Finland. They were wrong about the attempt, but they were right about the difficulty. Let us focus first on the Karelian Isthmus, the main stage of the initial assault. Here lay the Mannerheim Line. It is important to strip away the myth of this line. It was not a solid wall of concrete like the French Maginot Line. It was a series of field fortifications, trenches, machine gun nests, and dugouts, utilizing the natural terrain of lakes and marshes to funnel the enemy into kill zones. There were some concrete bunkers, yes, but many were old, dating back to the early 20s. The true strength of the Mannerheim Line was not the concrete. It was the tenacity of the men inside it and the harshness of the terrain in front of it. As the Red Army advanced, they brought with them the might of industrial warfare. The T-26 and BT-5 tanks rumbled forward, their engines coughing black smoke into the pristine air. The Soviet infantry, wearing brown greatcoats, advanced in waves. In the early days, they marched almost shoulder to shoulder, shouting "Ura," singing revolutionary songs, expecting to be welcomed as liberators by the Finnish working class. Instead, they were met with well-aimed fire. The Finnish defensive doctrine was one of flexibility and economy. They did not have the ammunition to waste on suppressing fire. Every shot had to count. The Finnish soldier was often a hunter, a man who had grown up in these woods. He knew how to move silently. He knew how to read the snow. The primary weapon of the Finnish infantrymen was the Mosin-Nagant rifle, similar to the Soviet standard issue, but often modified for better accuracy. But the weapon that would become legendary in this conflict was the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. It was a heavy, robust weapon with a 71-round drum magazine. In the close confines of a forest, it was devastating. A burst of fire from a Suomi could cut down a squad of men in seconds. The first week of December saw the Finns fighting a delaying action. They retreated slowly, trading space for time, inflicting casualties, and then slipping away before the Soviet artillery could zero in on their positions. This was the screening force, designed to slow the enemy while the main army mobilized and manned the Mannerheim Line further back. It was during these early days that the Soviet commanders began to realize the flaw in their plan. The roads in Finland were few and narrow. In the summer, they were dirt tracks. In the winter, they were icy chutes surrounded by deep, soft snow. The Soviet divisions were road-bound. Their trucks, their heavy artillery, their field kitchens, everything was tied to the road. This created massive columns, miles long, stretching back to the border. The weather began to turn. In early December, the snow was still relatively shallow, perhaps a foot deep, but the temperature started its steady descent. The Soviet troops were ill-equipped for this. Their brown uniforms stood out starkly against the white snow, making them perfect targets. They lacked white camouflage. Many lacked proper winter boots, wearing instead the standard-issue Kurza boots which offered little insulation. The Finns, by contrast, were in their element. They wore white snow capes over their uniforms. They moved on skis. A Finnish soldier on skis could move cross-country, through the dense forest, flanking the road-bound Soviet columns, striking from the side, and vanishing before the enemy could turn their turrets. As the Soviet 7th Army crashed against the main defenses of the Mannerheim Line, the reality of the war settled in. The initial Soviet tactics were rigid. Commanders were terrified of disobeying orders or showing a lack of revolutionary zeal. If the order was to advance, they advanced. even if it meant walking into a machine gun crossfire. Wave after wave of infantry would be sent across open fields of ice. The Finnish machine gunners, manning their Maxims in freezing bunkers, would fire until the water in the cooling jackets boiled and the barrels glowed red. There are accounts of Finnish gunners suffering psychological breakdowns not from fear, but from the sheer horror of the slaughter they were inflicting. They watched as hundreds of men fell, only to be replaced by hundreds more, stepping over the bodies of their comrades. But it was not just a slaughter. It was a grinding, terrifying contest of endurance. The Soviet tanks were a major problem for the Finns. Finland had almost no anti-tank guns. They had to improvise. This is where the close-quarters combat became truly visceral. Finnish soldiers, often operating at night, would sneak up on the Soviet tanks. They would use logs to jam the tracks or crowbars to pry open hatches. And they used the Molotov cocktails, a glass bottle filled with a mixture of gasoline, kerosene, and tar, with a storm match attached to the side. The soldier would light the match, throw the bottle against the engine deck of the tank. The bottle would shatter, the fuel would ignite, and the flames would be sucked into the engine intake or the crew compartment. It was desperate, terrifying work. To get close enough to throw a bottle, a tank requires a specific kind of courage. While the main force held the line on the isthmus, a different kind of war was developing in the vast wilderness north of Lake Ladoga. This area, known as Ladoga Karelia, was a region of ancient forests and few roads. The Soviet plan here was ambitious: to push through the wilderness, flank the Mannerheim line from the north, and strike deep into central Finland to cut the country in half. The Soviet 163rd and 44th Divisions were assigned this task. They moved heavy equipment onto narrow logging roads that were never designed for such weight. It was here, near the village of Suomussalmi and the Rot Road, that the disparity in mobility became most apparent. The Soviet columns, miles long, ground to a halt. The leading vehicles would be stopped by mines or felled trees. The rear vehicles couldn't turn around. They were trapped. The Finns, moving silently on skis, began to employ a tactic that would become famous: the modi. The word comes from a Swedish term for a cord of firewood waiting to be chopped. The Finns would isolate sections of the long Soviet column, cutting the road at intervals. They would surround these isolated pockets, the modis, and then proceed to reduce them one by one. Imagine the situation for a Soviet soldier in one of these modis. You are stuck on a narrow road in a foreign forest. It is dark for 18 hours a day. You cannot leave the road because the snow in the forest is waist deep and you have no skis. You cannot light a fire because it will draw sniper fire. You are running low on food. Your vehicle has run out of fuel. And from the darkness of the trees, you hear the sound of skis gliding over snow. The invisible enemy strikes, fires a few bursts, throws grenades, and vanishes. You are cold, hungry, and terrified. The psychological toll was immense. By mid-December, the weather, which had been cold, turned brutal. The mercury dropped to 20, then 30 degrees below 0 Celsius. This was not just cold, it was a lethal force. Metal became dangerous to touch with bare skin. It would bond instantly, tearing the flesh when pulled away. Gun oil froze, jamming weapons. Vehicle engines had to be kept running 24 hours a day to prevent the blocks from cracking, consuming precious fuel. If an engine stopped, a fire had to be built under the chassis to thaw it out. For the wounded, the cold was a death sentence. A man wounded in the open would freeze to death in minutes if not evacuated. The blood would crystallize in the wound. The morphine syrettes carried by the medics would freeze solid. They had to carry the morphine in their mouths or armpits to keep it liquid. The dead were frozen stiff as boards, often stacked like cordwood because the ground was too hard to dig graves. In the Talviavi sector, north of Lake Ladoga, the Finns achieved their first major offensive victory in mid-December. Colonel Paavo Talvela, a man of immense energy and aggression, led a counterattack against the Soviet 139th Division. The battle took place across frozen lakes and through a tourist hotel that had been fortified by the Soviets. It was a chaotic, close-range fight. The Finns, fueled by sisu, that untranslatable Finnish concept of grit, determination, and guts, stormed across the ice. They took heavy casualties, but they broke the Soviet division. It was a turning point for morale. It proved that the Red Army could be beaten. It proved that the bear could be made to bleed. Back on the isthmus, the Soviet attacks continued relentlessly. The Suma sector, a critical gap in the defensive line, saw some of the heaviest fighting. The Soviets would bombard the Finnish positions for hours, turning the earth into a cratered moonscape. Then the tanks would come. The Finns had discovered that the vision slits on the Soviet tanks were vulnerable. Snipers would aim for these tiny openings. They also learned to separate the infantry from the tanks. If they could pin down the Soviet infantry with machine gun fire, the tanks would continue forward alone, blind and vulnerable to the tank hunter teams waiting with their satchel charges and petrol bombs. Life in the Finnish dugouts was a study in contrast. Outside, the air was shattering with explosions. Inside, in the candlelit bunkers, men tried to sleep, to eat, to write letters. The smell was a mix of unwashed bodies, damp wool, tobacco smoke, and the cordite stench of war. Food was simple: pea soup, rye bread, porridge. Coffee was the lifeblood of the army, hot and black, keeping the sentries awake during the long, dark shifts. The communication lines were fragile. Runners had to carry messages when the telephone wires were cut by artillery, sprinting through the barrage, guided only by the familiarity of the terrain. As Christmas approached, a strange lull settled over parts of the front, though the artillery never truly stopped. The Soviet leadership was stunned. Their 2-week march to Helsinki had turned into a disaster. They had lost thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and had gained only a few miles of scorched earth. Stalin was furious. The initial commanders were sacked or executed. The entire strategy had to be rethought. But for the moment, in the deep snows of December, the Finnish David was holding off the Soviet Goliath. The world watched in amazement. Foreign correspondents flocked to Helsinki, sending back stories of the plucky Finns skiing circles around the lumbering Russian bear. Volunteers began to arrive: Swedes, Norwegians, Hungarians, Americans, drawn by the romance of the cause. But help from the Western powers, France and Britain, remained a distant promise, tangled in politics and logistics. Finland was fighting alone. In the north, the Mahdi's were tightening. The trapped Soviet divisions were starving. The horses were eaten first, then the leather belts were boiled for soup. The cold grew more intense, dropping to 40 below. At night, the forests echoed with the sounds of the dying and the occasional crack of a rifle. The Finns used psychological warfare, setting up loudspeakers to broadcast propaganda to the freezing Soviet troops, playing nostalgic Russian music, reminding them of the warmth of home, asking them why they were dying in a Finnish snowbank for politicians in Moscow. The Battle of Suomussalmi was reaching its climax. The Finnish Colonel H. Jalmar Siilasvuo had cut the Soviet 163rd Division into pieces. Now he turned his attention to the 44th Division on the Rot Road. This was an elite unit comprised of Ukrainian troops, bringing with them heavy artillery and a brass band intended for the victory parade. They were strung out along 20 miles of road, unable to move. The Finns, moving like ghosts through the trees, struck the column at multiple points. Panic began to set in. One must visualize the scene on the Rot Road to comprehend the magnitude of the defeat. A narrow road carved through a dense pine forest. Piled high on the sides are the snowbanks, and on the road, a graveyard of machinery. Trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, staff cars, field kitchens, all abandoned or destroyed. The bodies of thousands of Soviet soldiers lay in the snow, frozen in the positions in which they fell. Some were clustered around cold campfires. Others were slumped over the steering wheels of their trucks. The Finns swept through, gathering immense amounts of booty, rifles, machine guns, tanks that they would repaint and turn against their former owners. It was a victory of tactics over brute force, of mobility over mass. But while the North provided victories, the Isthmus remained a meat grinder. The sheer weight of the Soviet artillery was beginning to erode the Finnish defenses. The concrete bunkers, few as they were being pounded into dust. The earthworks were collapsing. The men were exhausted. A Finnish soldier might go 3 or 4 days without sleep, living on adrenaline and fear. The reserves were thin. Every man lost was a man who could not be replaced. The Soviets, on the other hand, seemed to have an endless supply of men. If a battalion was wiped out, a regiment took its place. As 1939 bled into 1940, the war entered a new, more desperate phase. The Soviet Union had learned from its mistakes. They stopped the chaotic, uncoordinated attacks. They brought in General Semyon Timoshenko to take command. He brought a new discipline and a new method. No longer would infantry be sent in human waves without support. Now artillery would be the god of war. They massed guns wheel to wheel, concentrating fire on narrow sectors of the line, pulverizing the defenses before sending in the tanks and infantry. They built mock-ups of the Finnish bunkers behind their lines and practiced assaulting them. They issued better winter gear. They brought in heavy KV-1 tanks, monsters that were impervious to the Finnish anti-tank rifles. The Finns felt the shift. The bombardments became heavier, more precise. The drumfire of artillery became a constant, maddening noise that drove men to the brink of insanity. The snow, once white and pristine, was now stained black with soot and explosives, and red with blood. The forests were shorn, the trees snapped like matchsticks by the shelling. The landscape itself was being erased. Yet even in the face of this growing storm, the daily life of the soldier continued. The waiting, the cleaning of the weapon, the search for warmth, the camaraderie of the squad, where men became closer than brothers, knowing that their lives depended on the man next to them. They spoke of home, of their farms, of the sauna. They did not speak much of the enemy, other than with a professional respect for their tenacity and a deep hatred for the invasion. They fought not for glory, but for survival, for the very existence of their homes behind them. The air war also intensified. The Finnish Air Force, flying a motley collection of aircraft, Dutch Fokkers, British Gladiators, Italian Fiats, punched well above its weight. The Finnish pilots developed the pendulum tactic to attack Soviet bomber formations, diving and climbing to slash at the enemy. Aces like Ilmari Juutalainen began to tally their victories. But for every Soviet plane shot down, it seemed 2 more appeared. The skies over Karelia were dangerous. In the bunkers of the Mannerheim line, the strain was physical. The ventilation was poor, carbon monoxide from the stoves, and the weapons caused headaches and nausea. The lice were a constant plague, but the line held. Through December and into January, against all odds, the line held. The miracle of the Winter War was not a single event, but a daily repetition of impossible resistance. One specific sector, near the village of Taipale on the eastern side of the isthmus, saw incredibly fierce fighting. Here, the Vuoksi River flowed into Lake Ladoga. The terrain was open, flat fields offering no cover. The Soviet artillery pounded the Finnish trenches day and night. The men dubbed it the slaughterhouse. Yet, the Finnish artillery, though short on shells, was deadly accurate. They knew the coordinates of every inch of the ground. When the Soviet infantry attacked across the ice of the Suvanto waterway, the Finnish shore batteries waited until they were in the open, then opened fire. The ice shattered, sending men and equipment into the freezing black water. As January settled in, the deep winter truly arrived. This was the time of the White Death. The snow was now meters deep. The silence between the artillery barrages was profound. In the northern wilderness, the isolated Soviet garrisons that had survived the initial Mahdi's were slowly dying. They were receiving supplies only by air, often dropped into the Finnish lines by mistake. The Finns, scavenging these supplies, found sausages, felt boots, and ammunition. They called it General Winter's supply drop. We must pause here in the heart of January. The war has been raging for 6 weeks. The Soviet blitzkrieg has failed. The Finnish defense has surprised the world, but the giant is waking up. The Red Army is reorganizing, re-equipping, and preparing for a blow that they believe will shatter the Finnish resistance once and for all. The soldiers in the trenches can feel it coming. The artillery fire is getting heavier every day. The probing attacks are becoming more systematic. The long, dark nights are filled with the noise of engines gathering on the other side of the line. The miracle has happened, but the question remains: how long can it last against the sheer mathematics of war? The snow falls gently on the bodies frozen on the rot road, covering the horror in a blanket of white. In Helsinki, the government pleads for aid. In Moscow, Stalin demands results. And in the forests of Karelia, the Finnish soldier tightens his grip on his rifle, pulls his white hood lower over his face, and watches the darkness. The first act is over. The grinding attrition is about to begin. The dawn of February brought a change in the very air of the Karelian Isthmus. The temperature remained brutally low, hovering around -30 degrees Celsius, but the silence that had occasionally punctuated the earlier months of the war had vanished entirely. General Timoshenko had spent January preparing his instrument of destruction. He had observed the failures of the early invasion, the lack of coordination, the vulnerability of the infantry, the foolishness of road-bound columns, and he had ruthlessly corrected them. The Red Army that faced the Finns in February 1940 was no longer a disorganized mob. It was a colossal, mechanized sledgehammer poised to strike a single, decisive blow. The Soviet strategy focused on the Lech sector of the Mannerheim Line, near the village of Summa. This was the gateway to Viipuri, Finland's second-largest city. The terrain here was open, less marshy, and suitable for heavy tanks. Timoshenko massed an unbelievable concentration of artillery, over 300 guns for every mile of front. On the 1st of February, the bombardment began. It was not the sporadic, harassing fire of December. It was a systematic pulverization. The Finns called it the drum fire. It was a continuous, rolling roar that did not cease for days. The ground shook so violently that men in the dugouts felt as if they were at sea. The snow was blasted away, revealing the frozen, torn earth beneath. The forests that had provided cover were reduced to splintered stumps, offering no hiding place from the spotter planes circling overhead like vultures. For the Finnish soldiers in the bunkers, existence became a waking nightmare. Sleep was impossible. The concussions from the heavy 203mm howitzer shells caused internal injuries even to men who were not hit by shrapnel. Ears bled, noses bled, and minds began to fracture. The concrete of the bunkers, built in the 1920s and not designed for this caliber of modern weaponry, began to crack. The steel rebar was exposed, twisted like spaghetti. The Millionaire Bunker, a massive fortification in the Summa sector, became a focal point of the fury. It was pounded day and night. The men inside bailed out water and dust, repaired the firing slits during the brief lulls, and waited for the inevitable infantry assault. This time, when the Soviet infantry attacked, they did not run blindly into machine gun fire. They used armored sleds pushed by tanks to get close to the Finnish lines. They used smoke screens to blind the defenders. The tanks, the heavy KV-1s and T-28s, advanced in coordination with the infantry. If a Finnish machine gun opened up, the tanks would stop and blast the nest with their main guns. The Soviet combat engineers, brave and skilled, crept forward with flamethrowers and demolition charges to blow open the bunker doors. For 10 days the Finns held. It was a testament to human endurance that defies logical explanation. Reserves were thrown in, comprising older men and mere boys, armed with whatever weapons could be scraped together. There were no more anti-tank guns. The few Bofors guns they had were worn out or destroyed. The soldiers resorted to desperate measures. They would wait for the Soviet tanks to overrun their trenches, letting the steel monsters pass over them, and then pop up to engage the infantry following behind. Or they would leap onto the back of a tank, trying to smash the periscopes or shove a log into the tracks. But for every tank destroyed, 2 more appeared from the smoke. On February 11th, the dam finally broke. The sheer weight of the Soviet offensive cracked the line at the Let sector. The millionaire bunker was surrounded. Soviet engineers managed to place a massive charge of explosives on the roof. The explosion was felt for miles. With the bunker neutralized, the Soviet tanks poured through the gap. The Finnish defense was not pierced by a needle, but smashed by a battering ram. The defenders were physically and mentally spent. Some battalions had lost half their strength. Ammunition was critically low. The artillery support, always meager, had fallen silent as shells ran out. Field Marshal Mannerheim, watching the maps in his headquarters in Mikkeli, realized the gravity of the situation. To stay in the forward positions was suicide. The line had been breached, and the Soviet armor was threatening to encircle the remaining defenders. On February 15th, he gave the heavy-hearted order to retreat. The army was to pull back to the intermediate line, and then to the VKT line, Viapuri Kuparsari Tapale, a defensive position anchoring on the city of Viapuri and the Vuoksi water system. The retreat was a somber affair. Men who had held their ground for 2 months, who had buried their friends in the snow of summer, had to leave the graves behind. They marched at night to avoid the Soviet aircraft, trudging through the snow, dragging their few remaining heavy weapons. The roads were clogged with refugees as well, civilians fleeing the advancing Red Army, taking their cattle and meager possessions on sleds. The sky behind them glowed red, not from the sun but from the burning villages. The Finns practiced a scorched earth policy. Nothing of value was to be left for the invader. Farmhouses, barns, haystacks, all were put to the torch. The Soviet advance was cautious but relentless. They were wary of traps, remembering the Mahdi's of the north, but on the open isthmus their power was undeniable. They reached the intermediate line quickly. The fighting there was confused and bitter. The Finns were trying to dig new trenches in the frozen ground while under fire. The frost was over a meter deep. Digging was impossible without explosives, which they did not have. They fought from shallow scrapes in the snow, behind boulders, and in the ruins of cellars. By late February, the war had shifted to the outskirts of Viapuri. This ancient city, with its medieval castle standing guard over the harbor, became the new front line. The VKT line was the last barrier. If this fell, the road to Helsinki was open. The fighting here took on a different character. It was urban warfare mixed with frozen amphibious assaults. The Gulf of Finland was frozen solid. The ice was thick enough to support tanks. This created a terrifying new flank. The Soviets could bypass the land defenses by driving their tanks across the sea ice to attack the Finnish coast west of Viapuri. The Finns scrambled to defend the shoreline. They reinforced the coastal islands, turning summer cottages into machine gun nests. The battles for these islands in the Gulf of Finland were surreal. Imagine a flat, white plain of ice stretching to the horizon. There is no cover, no trees, no rocks, nothing but wind and snow. Across this plain come hundreds of black dots, Soviet infantry, and the dark, blocky shapes of tanks. The Finnish defenders on the islands watched them come. They had almost no heavy weapons to stop the tanks on the ice. They tried to cut channels in the ice with saws to create moats, but the water froze over again too quickly. They laid mines on the ice surface, covering them with snow. When the battle joined, it was a slaughter on the ice. The Soviet infantry, exposed and vulnerable, were cut down by machine gun fire from the islands. But the tanks kept coming. They rolled over the frozen sea, their tracks crunching on the ice, firing high-explosive shells into the island defenses. The Finnish coastal artillery, huge guns designed to fight battleships, were turned inland. They fired massive shells onto the ice, not trying to hit individual tanks, but to shatter the ice itself. Great geysers of water and ice shards erupted. Tanks that were hit or fell into the cracks sank instantly into the dark, freezing water, taking their crews with them. But there were always more. One by one the islands fell. The Soviets established a beachhead on the mainland, west of Viapuri, threatening to encircle the city. In the north, the war had settled into a stalemate, but a stalemate of death. The great victories of Suomussalmi were in the past. Now the Finnish troops there were pinned down, unable to move south to help their comrades on the isthmus. The Swedish volunteers, flying their own aircraft and manning artillery batteries in the north, provided some relief, allowing a few Finnish units to be transferred, but it was a drop in the bucket. The situation in the air had become desperate. The Soviet Air Force had total air superiority. They roamed the skies at will, bombing supply lines, rail junctions, and cities. The Finnish pilots were exhausted. Their planes were riddled with bullet holes and patched with canvas and dope. They flew 4-5 sorties a day. The focus shifted from shooting down bombers to trying to stop the ground columns, strafing the Soviet infantry on the ice. It was dangerous work. The Soviet columns bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Inside Viipuri, the city was dying. The beautiful architecture, the blend of Finnish and Russian styles, was being pulverized. The library, the cathedral, the harbor, all were targets. The few civilians who remained lived in cellars. The defending troops fought building to building, room to room. The noise was deafening, magnified by the stone streets. The smell of burning timber and pulverized brick dust choked the air. As March began, the Finnish army was on the verge of total collapse. The battalions were ghosts. Companies that should have had 200 men were down to 30. Lieutenants were commanding battalions. Sergeants were commanding companies. The ammunition shortage was catastrophic. Artillery batteries were limited to a handful of shells per day. Soldiers were counting their rifle rounds, and yet they did not run. They stood in their foxholes, eyes red with fatigue, and fired until the gun clicked empty. The concept of sisu had moved beyond simple grit. It had become a refusal to accept reality. But reality was happening in Moscow. Peace negotiations were secretly underway. The Finnish government in Helsinki realized that no help was coming from the West. France and Britain had talked of sending an expeditionary force, but it was all talk, plans to secure Swedish iron ore mines disguised as aid for Finland. The Swedes and Norwegians refused to allow transit for Allied troops, fearing they would be dragged into the larger European war. Finland was alone. The choice was stark: make peace now and lose territory, or continue fighting and lose the entire nation. The Soviet Union, too, was ready to talk. Stalin had his victory, though it had cost him dearly. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic casualties. Estimates would later range from 126,000 to nearly 400,000 dead or missing, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. The reputation of the Red Army had been tarnished. Stalin wanted to end the campaign before the spring thaw turned the roads to mud and before the Western powers could intervene. He presented harsh terms. On the front lines, the soldiers knew nothing of the diplomats in Moscow. They only knew that the attacks were getting stronger. On the VKT line, the Soviets were preparing for the final push to take Viipuri. The artillery barrage reached a crescendo in the first week of March. It was a storm of steel. The Finnish radio operators, frantically calling for support, received only silence or orders to hold at all costs. There is a tragic irony in the timing of war. As the diplomats argued over lines on a map in the Kremlin, men were dying for those same lines in the snow. A hill would be taken by the Soviets in the morning, retaken by the Finns at noon, and lost again in the evening, costing hundreds of lives, only for that hill to be ceded by treaty the next day anyway. The rumors began to spread through the trenches, whispers of peace, whispers of a treaty. But the officers ordered the men to ignore them. Fight, they said. Fight until the order comes. On March 12th, the treaty was signed in Moscow. The terms were brutal. Finland would lose the entire Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri. They would lose the land north of Lake Ladoga. They would lose the Hanko Peninsula. 12% of Finland's territory, home to 12% of its population and much of its industry, was to be handed over. But the ceasefire was not set to take effect until 11 a.m. Finnish time on March 13th. The war had one final morning to claim its due. The morning of March 13th was clear and cold. The sun shone on the battered ruins of Viipuri and the cratered fields of the isthmus. Both sides knew the end was coming. The logical thing would have been to stop shooting. But war is rarely logical. In many sectors, the artillery fire actually intensified in the final hours. The Soviets wanted to fire off their remaining ammunition rather than haul it back. The Finns fired their last few precious shells in a final act of defiance. Men died at 10 o'clock. Men died at 10:30. Men died at 10:55. There is a story of a Finnish machine gunner who kept firing until 1 minute to 11. He then stopped, disassembled his weapon, cleaned it meticulously, and sat down in the snow weeping. Not for joy, but for the bitterness of the moment. At 11 o'clock precisely, a strange sound swept across the front. It was the sound of silence. The gun stopped, the roar of the engines faded, the screaming of the shells ceased. After 105 days of hell, the winter war was over. Cautiously, suspiciously, men began to emerge from their holes. Soviet soldiers stood up in their trenches. Finnish soldiers peered over the parapets. In some places, they stared at each other across a few hundred yards of no man's land. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just a profound, heavy exhaustion. The Finns looked at the land they were standing on, the land they had defended with their blood, and realized they now had to leave it. They had not been defeated on the battlefield in the sense of a rout. The army was still intact, still holding the line. But the war was lost. The aftermath began immediately. The terms of the treaty required the Finns to evacuate the ceded territories within days. This triggered one of the most heartbreaking migrations in history. 400,000 Karelians, men, women, children, elderly, left their homes. They packed what they could onto wagons, sleds, and trucks. They took their livestock. They burned what they couldn't carry. They refused to live under Soviet rule. As the Soviet troops moved in to occupy the new territories, they found empty villages, empty houses, and ghost towns. The Finns had taken everything, even the church bells. The march of the evacuees was a river of sorrow flowing west. Soldiers who had just laid down their rifles now helped their families pack. They walked past the fresh graves of their comrades, knowing they would never visit them again. The Soviet Union had gained the land, but they had gained a desert. The Winter War was a small conflict in the context of the Second World War, a sideshow to the greater conflagration consuming Europe. But its impact was profound. It revealed the weaknesses of the Red Army to the world, and to Hitler, who watched closely and concluded that the Soviet Union was a giant with feet of clay, a miscalculation that would lead to the invasion of Russia the following year. It showed the world the capacity of a free people to resist tyranny against impossible odds. For the Finnish people, the war became the defining moment of their national identity. They had lost land, but they had kept their independence. They had avoided the fate of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which were swallowed whole by the Soviet Union. The price was high, 26,000 dead, 43,000 wounded. But the spirit of the Winter War, the unity, the sacrifice, the sisu remained. As spring finally came to Finland in 1940, the snow melted. It revealed the scars on the land, the craters, the trenches, the shattered trees. And it revealed the bodies of the missing, the thousands of Soviet soldiers who had vanished into the white drifts, finally returning to the earth. The forests of Karelia grew silent again, but it was a different silence. It was a silence heavy with the memory of what had happened there in the frozen dark when the ice held and the fire burned. This concludes the story of the Winter War, a story of ice, of blood, and of the indomitable human spirit. Though the guns fell silent on that chilly morning of March 13th, the story of the Winter War did not truly end with the drying of the ink on the Moscow Peace Treaty. For the people of Finland, the silence of the battlefield was replaced by the roar of a different kind of struggle, a struggle of displacement, memory, and an uneasy, fragile peace. To fully understand the magnitude of this conflict, we must look beyond the trench lines and into the immediate aftermath. as well as the individual legends that rose from the snow to define a nation's spirit. The days immediately following the ceasefire witnessed one of the most poignant tragedies in Nordic history, the evacuation of Karelia. Imagine, if you will, a population of nearly 450,000 people, farmers, shopkeepers, fishermen, being told they had mere days to leave the land their families had cultivated for centuries. The treaty handed the territory to the Soviet Union, but it did not hand over the people. The choice was voluntary: stay and become Soviet citizens, or leave and keep your Finnish identity. Almost to a person, they chose to leave. The roads leading west from the Karelian Isthmus became rivers of sorrow. It was a biblical exodus in subzero temperatures. Horse-drawn sleighs were piled high with heirlooms, grandfather clocks, rocking chairs, heavy wooden chests filled with linens. Cattle were herded through the deep snow, their breath steaming in the cold air, driven by children walking alongside the road. There was a stoic silence to this procession. Men who had just survived the drumfire of the artillery now walked with heads bowed, not in defeat, but in the heavy labor of moving their entire lives. Behind them, columns of smoke rose into the gray sky. Many families, unable to bear the thought of a Soviet commissar living in their home, chose to burn their farmhouses to the ground. They left the conquerors nothing but scorched earth and ashes. This evacuation was a logistical nightmare for the Finnish government, yet it was handled with the same efficiency and sisu that had defined the war effort. These refugees needed to be housed, fed, and integrated into the rest of Finland. Every municipality, every village in the unoccupied lands opened its doors. It was a collective national embrace. The Quick Settlement Act was passed, giving land to the displaced farmers, often slicing up larger existing estates to make room. It was a painful, difficult process, but it prevented the creation of a permanent refugee class. The Karelians were not outcasts, they were family who had lost their room in the house. While the nation licked its wounds, the stories of individual heroism began to crystallize into legend. During the chaos of the fighting, names were often just whispers on the wind. Now, in the quiet of the interim peace, the world began to learn the full details of men like Simo Heihe. We touched upon the snipers earlier, but Heihe deserves a closer look, for he embodies the terrifying efficiency of the Finnish soldier. Known as the White Death, Heihe was a mild-mannered farmer and hunter from the municipality of Rotjärvi. He was a small man, standing only 5 feet 3 inches tall. In the Kala sector, north of Lake Ladoga, he terrorized the Soviet lines. He did not use a high-powered scope that might catch the glint of the sun and reveal his position. Instead, he used the simple iron sights of his Mosin-Nagant rifle. This allowed him to keep his head lower, presenting a smaller target. He developed techniques that were almost instinctual. He would pack the snow into a hard mound in front of his position to rest his rifle, preventing the muzzle blast from kicking up a puff of fresh snow. He was known to keep snow in his mouth while waiting, to stop the steam of his breath from betraying him in the freezing air. For 98 days he hunted. The Soviet commanders, frustrated and terrified by the unseen threat decimating their officers, sent counter-snipers to find him. Heihe killed them. They called in artillery strikes on likely sniper positions. He survived. By the time he was finally wounded, hit in the jaw by an exploding bullet just days before the war ended, he was credited with over 500 confirmed kills. He awoke from a coma on the day peace was declared, half his face shattered but alive. He would live to be 96 years old, a quiet testament to the survivor's spirit. When asked later how he became such a good shot, he replied with a single word: practice. But the war was not fought by men alone. The story of the Winter War is incomplete without the Lada Sved. This was the women's auxiliary organization, named after a fictional heroine in a poem by Johan Ludvig Runeberg. With over 100,000 members, the Ladas were the backbone of the Finnish defense. They did not carry rifles, but they carried the weight of the war's logistics. They manned the air observation towers, standing for hours in the freezing wind on high wooden platforms, scanning the sky for Soviet bombers. They ran the field kitchens, dragging heavy cauldrons of soup through the snow to the front lines, often under fire. They worked in the field hospitals, scrubbing blood from the floors, holding the hands of dying boys and closing the eyes of the dead. They knitted thousands of pairs of wool socks and mittens, the white gold that saved so many soldiers from frostbite. The Ladas freed up almost every able-bodied man to fight on the line. Their motto was for home and faith, and their contribution was absolute. In the cemeteries of Finland, you will often see the simple Lada Svad emblem on gravestones, marking the resting place of women who gave just as much as the soldiers. As the spring of 1940 melted the snows, military analysts around the world began to dissect the conflict. The Winter War changed the way the world thought about winter warfare. It proved that heavy mechanization had severe limits in difficult terrain. The Soviet reliance on roads had been their undoing. The Finnish use of ski troops became a model for specialized mountain and winter units in other armies, including the United States 10th Mountain Division later in the war. The Marty tactic, the encirclement and chopping up of enemy columns, became a textbook example of defeat in detail. However, it also served as a grim warning. The Soviets learned. They realized that their command structure was too rigid, their communication too poor, and their cooperation between tanks and infantry non-existent. The Red Army that marched into Berlin in 1945 was forged in the failures of the Finnish forests. The painful lessons of Suomussalmi and the Rot Road helped modernize the Soviet military machine, stripping away the political purge's incompetence and replacing it with hard-won pragmatism. For Finland, the peace that began in March 1940 was known as the interim peace. It was a time of high anxiety. The Soviet Union continued to exert pressure, interfering in Finnish domestic politics, demanding right-of-way for their trains to the new base at Hanko, and shooting down a Finnish passenger plane, the Kaleva, during peacetime. The Finns felt the noose tightening again. They knew that Stalin had not abandoned his goal of conquering the whole country. He had merely postponed it. This desperation drove Finland into the arms of the only power capable of deterring the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. It was a marriage of necessity, not ideology. As 1940 turned into 1941, German troops began to transit through Finland to occupied Norway. Weapons and grain began to flow from Berlin to Helsinki. The Finns, democratic and Western-leaning, found themselves walking a moral tightrope, preparing to fight alongside a dictatorship to save themselves from another dictatorship. This path would lead them directly into the Continuation War in June 1941, a bloody sequel that would last for 3 more years. But if we look back solely at the Winter War, at those 105 days in the snow, what remains is the purity of the defense. It is rare in history to find a conflict where the moral lines seem so clearly drawn. A small, democratic nation standing alone against an aggressive, totalitarian empire. There is a final image that captures the essence of this war. After the ceasefire, a joint Finnish-Soviet commission met to demarcate the new border. A Soviet general, looking at a map of the meager territory they had gained at such a terrible cost, hundreds of thousands of casualties for a strip of land, remarked quietly to a Finnish officer, "We have won just enough ground to bury our dead." That is the legacy of the Winter War. It is remembered not for the land that was lost, but for the soul that was kept. It remains a study in resilience, a reminder that the will of a people, united and fighting for their homes, can defy the calculus of empires. The forests of Karelia have grown back. The trenches have eroded into soft depressions in the earth, covered in moss. But in the silence of the Nordic winter, If you listen closely to the wind in the pines, you can still hear the echo of the skis, the crack of the moss and nagant, and the breathing of men who stood in the snow and said, "This far and no further." This brings our journey through the Winter War to its final close. From the first artillery shell at Manila to the silent exodus of the Karelians, it is a story that belongs to history, but its heartbeat, the Sisu, remains timeless. We have traversed the chronological arc of the Winter War, from the first shots at Manila to the bitter silence of the peace treaty. But a historical event of this magnitude is not merely a timeline of battles and shifting borders. To fully grasp the experience of those 105 days, we must step back from the trenches of the Karelian Isthmus and look at the other dimensions of the conflict. The war in the skies, the struggle on the frozen seas, the mobilization of the home front, and the desperate, often heartbreaking, efforts to save the next generation. These are the layers that turn a military campaign into a national saga. Let us turn our eyes first to the sky. The air war over Finland was a contest of such asymmetry that it seemed almost suicidal for the defenders. When the war began, the Finnish Air Force had roughly 114 operational aircraft. The Soviet Union had deployed nearly 3,800. On paper, the Red Air Force should have swept the Finnish planes from the sky in the first 48 hours. They did not. The backbone of the Finnish fighter force was the Fokker D-21. It was a Dutch design, a fixed-gear monoplane that looked almost obsolete compared to the sleek, retractable-gear fighters of the great powers. But it was rugged, simple to maintain, and crucially it had skis. While Soviet aircraft required cleared concrete or tarmac runways, the Finnish Fokkers could operate from frozen lakes, flat fields, or clearings in the forest. This allowed the Finns to disperse their fleet. A squadron would not sit at a known airbase waiting to be bombed. It would be scattered across a dozen remote lakes, hidden under tree branches and snow camouflage nets. The pilots developed tactics born of necessity. They knew they could not dogfight the faster Soviet I-16 fighters on equal terms. Instead, they used the pendulum tactic. They would climb high above the Soviet bomber formations, dive at near-vertical speeds to build up energy, slash through the formation firing their machine guns, and then use the momentum to zoom back up into the safety of the altitude, preparing for another pass. It was a deadly dance of energy management. The Finnish pilots were often older, more experienced men, experts in instrument flying, a critical skill in the dark, fog-bound Finnish winter. The Soviet bombers, primarily the SB-2 and the DB-3, flew in large formations. In the early days, they flew without fighter escorts, arrogant in their numbers. The Finnish Fokkers tore them apart. But as the war dragged on, the Soviets learned. They began to armor their cockpits. They began to fly in tighter defensive boxes. And they began to send fighters. One cannot speak of the air war without mentioning the weather. For days at a time, the sky would be a churning mass of gray clouds and blinding snow. In these conditions, flying was a terrifying ordeal. There was no radar. Navigation was done by map, compass, and stopwatch. To get lost over the endless white wilderness meant death. If you force-landed in the forest, you would freeze long before rescue could arrive. Mechanics worked with bare hands on frozen metal engines in temperatures of -40 degrees, warming the oil over open fires, sleeping in tents next to their aircraft. The attrition was high, not just from combat but from the sheer hostility of the elements. While the pilots fought in the clouds, another strange and unique theater of war was unfolding on the Baltic Sea. Finland possessed a navy, the pride of which were two coastal defense ships, the Ilmarinen and the Väinämöinen. These were peculiar vessels, heavy, slow, with shallow drafts designed for the rocky archipelago, but armed with massive 10-inch guns. As the winter deepened, the sea began to freeze. By January, the ships were locked in ice in the harbor of Turku. They were painted white to blend in with the harbor ice and used as floating anti-aircraft batteries. The naval war, therefore, was fought not by ships, but by coastal artillery and patrols on the ice. The Gulf of Finland is dotted with islands, Hogland, Seiskari, Lavansaari. These became fortresses. The Soviets wanted them to secure the approach to Leningrad. The Finns had fortified them with heavy guns, some dating back to the Imperial Russian era. The duels between the Soviet battleships, moving in the open water further west, and the Finnish island forts were thunderous affairs. But as the ice thickened, the war became an infantry struggle. We spoke earlier of the battles on the ice near Viipuri, but the isolation of the island garrisons was a unique horror. Cut off from the mainland by miles of open ice, pounded by aircraft, running low on food, the men on the islands fought a lonely war, watching the horizon for the dark shapes of the enemy sleds. But perhaps the most profound story of the Winter War did not take place on the battlefield at all. It took place in the train stations and the harbors of the western cities. It is the story of the Sodalapset, the war children. As the Soviet bombers began to target Finnish cities, raining destruction on Helsinki, Turku, and Tampere, a difficult decision was made. To protect the future of the nation, the children would be evacuated. Sweden, Finland's neighbor to the west, opened its arms. It began as a trickle, parents sending their children to stay with relatives in Sweden. But soon it became an organized state program. Picture a train station in Helsinki in the dead of winter. It is night to avoid the bombers. The platform is crowded with mothers and children. The fathers are gone at the front. The steam from the locomotive hisses in the cold air. The children are bundled in layers of wool. Around their necks they wear a cardboard tag. On the tag is a number, their name, and their destination. For many of these children, too young to understand, this tag is their only identity. The separation scenes were heart-wrenching. Mothers clutching their toddlers, whispering promises that it would only be for a few weeks, that they were going on an adventure. The children, some crying, some silent with shock, boarding the trains. The train ride to the port of Turku or north to Tornio was dangerous. The tracks were targets. Trains would often have to stop in the middle of nowhere, the passengers rushing into the woods as Soviet planes strafed the carriages. Over 70,000 Finnish children were sent to Sweden, Denmark, and Norway during the war years. They were taken in by foster families. They entered a new world, a world of peace, where lights shone at night, where there was food, where no sirens wailed. But they faced a different kind of trauma. They were separated from their parents, their language, their homes. Many were too young to speak Swedish. They felt abandoned. While the physical safety of the children was secured, the psychological scar of this mass evacuation would mark an entire generation of Finns. It was a sacrifice made by the parents, a tearing of the heart to save the life, and it remains a complex, emotional legacy in Finland to this day. The mobilization of the home front was total. We touched upon the Lada Sved organization, but their ubiquity cannot be overstated. Finland was a nation of fewer than 4 million people. Every pair of hands was needed. In the countryside, with the men and horses gone to the front, the women took over the farms. They chopped the wood, fed the cattle, and cleared the snow. This was physically exhausting work in a pre-industrial agricultural society. If the farms failed, the army starved. In the factories, women and older men worked double shifts to produce ammunition. Finland's industrial capacity was small, but it was innovative. They produced the Suomi submachine guns, the Lahti anti-tank pistols, and the mortar shells that were so deadly in the forests. There was no concept of a civilian in the traditional sense. Everyone was part of the defense mechanism. The morale of the home front was sustained by radio broadcasts, by newspapers that printed the exploits of the army, while carefully censoring the severity of the situation, and by the Lutheran Church, which framed the war as a spiritual struggle against godless communism. We must also look at the international response, for the Winter War captured the imagination of the world in a way few conflicts do. Finland was the underdog, the land of heroes. In London, Paris, and New York, rallies were held. Money was raised. but material aid was slow to arrive. The politics of the time were messy. Britain and France were at war with Germany, but not with the Soviet Union. They were wary of pushing Stalin into a closer alliance with Hitler. However, individual men did not wait for their governments. Volunteers began to trickle in. The largest contingent came from Sweden. The Swedish government, declaring itself non-belligerent rather than strictly neutral, allowed the formation of the Swedish Volunteer Corps. Over 8,000 Swedes signed up. They were fully equipped with their own weapons, uniforms, and even aircraft. By late February, they had taken over the responsibility for a sector of the front in northern Finland, near Salla. This freed up Finnish troops to be rushed south to the critical battles on the isthmus. The Swedes fought bravely, suffering casualties, their presence a morale boost to the Finns who felt so isolated. Other volunteers were a motley mix of idealists, adventurers, and anti-communists. There were Hungarians, Norwegians, Danes. There were roughly 350 American Finns who returned to fight. A small group of British volunteers arrived, though too late to see combat. Among them, interestingly, was a young man named Christopher Lee, who would later become a famous actor. He, like many others, wanted to do something, though he would spend only 2 weeks in Finland, mostly on guard duty away from the front lines. The reality was that, while the idea of international brigades was romantic, the logistics of training and equipping men who spoke a dozen different languages in the middle of an Arctic winter was a nightmare for the Finnish High Command. The war ended before most of them could be deployed. As we analyze the Winter War, we must also consider the what-ifs. The British and French had drawn up plans to intervene. An expeditionary force was being assembled, ostensibly to help Finland, but with the ulterior motive of seizing the iron ore fields of Sweden and cutting off Germany's supply. The plan was fanciful, logistically impossible, and would likely have led to a war between the Allies and the Soviet Union. The Finns, realizing that this aid was a mirage and that it would turn their country into a battlefield between the great powers, wisely chose to sign the peace treaty with Moscow instead. The equipment of the war also deserves a final, closer look. We mentioned the Molotov cocktail, but the ingenuity of the Finnish soldier extended further. Lacking anti-tank mines, they built wooden box mines that were undetectable by metal detectors. They used logs to build tank traps on the forest roads. They utilized the Mahdi tactics not just to kill, but to capture. The amount of Soviet equipment captured in the Mahdis was staggering. The Finns, chronically short of artillery, captured hundreds of Soviet field guns, thousands of rifles, and dozens of tanks. These were quickly repaired, painted with the Finnish blue swastika, the national insignia at the time, unrelated to the Nazis, and turned against their former owners. It was said that the Soviet Union was Finland's primary supplier of armaments during the war. There is a tactile reality to this war that documents often miss. The sound of the ski bindings, a soft swish click in the silence of the forest, the smell of the sika pork stew in the field kitchens, the feeling of the wool uniform, itchy and damp, that a soldier might wear for 6 weeks without changing. The way a man's breath would freeze on his collar, creating a jagged rime of ice that rubbed the skin raw. The Winter War was an assault on the senses as much as a tactical contest. The legacy of the Winter War is also written in the landscape of modern Finland. If you travel to the border areas today, to Suomussalmi or Kumo, you can still find the remains. The dugouts have collapsed, but the pits are there. The trees still bear the scars of shrapnel. Sawmills in the region often complain about saw blades breaking on embedded Soviet steel in old logs. There are memorials everywhere, simple stone crosses, monuments to the Winter War, mass graves of the Soviet soldiers that have been respectfully marked. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the concept of sisu. Before the war, it was just a word. After the war, it became the national soul. It is a hard word to translate. It is not just courage. Courage is a flash of bravery. Sisu is the second wind. Sisu is what happens when you have reached the end of your physical and mental limits, and you simply continue because there is no other option. It is a grim, stoic determination. The Winter War proved to the Finns that they possessed this quality in abundance. It forged a unified national identity that had been fractured by their own civil war just 20 years earlier. In the trenches of Summa, the white and red Finns of 1918 ceased to exist. There were only Finns defending the fatherland. And so, we close this expanded view of the Winter War. We have seen the sniper in the snow, the pilot in the cloud, the child on the train, and the mother on the farm. It was a moment in time when a small nation held its breath, stood its ground, and survived. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was the coldest in a century, but in the fires of that winter, the steel of a nation was tempered. This completes the narrative journey of the Winter War. The story of Finland's war would continue, but the Winter War stands alone, a frozen monument to the power of resistance.